The Appalachian Mountains are old. Older than the towns built into them. Older than the families who tried to settle there. Some stories in these mountains were never written down. They were passed quietly, from one generation to the next. Not to entertain, but to warn. This is Vesper Shroud, and these are 10 true Appalachian horror stories passed down for generations. Stories shaped by isolation, darkness, and the kind of silence that listens back. Story 1. Hollow that never echoed. I should have known something was wrong the moment my voice died in the air. Not faded, not echoed, just died, like someone had reached out and strangled the sound before it could travel more than a few feet from my mouth. That kind of silence ISN. T-natural. That kind of silence is hungry. I am a sound engineer from Pittsburgh. 42 years old. Divorced. No kids. I spend my days recording audio for documentary films, chasing interesting sounds in interesting places. When I heard about the Hollow in eastern Kentucky, a place locals called the Dead Mouth, I thought it would make perfect material for the ambient sound library I was building. Unique locations, unusual acoustics, that was my specialty. I packed my recording equipment into my truck and drove south through the Appalachian Mountains on a gray October morning, excited about the strange acoustic phenomenon I heard whispered about in online forums dedicated to unusual places in America. The locals in the nearest town, a dying coal mining community called Ashford, didn't want to talk about it. When I asked the woman at the gas station for directions, her face went pale. She was probably 60, with deep lines around her mouth and eyes that looked like they'd seen too many hard winters. She shook her head slowly, her hands trembling as she counted my change. "Nobody goes to the Dead Mouth," she said quietly. "Not if they re-smart." I pressed her. I told her I was a professional. I explained the science of acoustic dead zones, how certain geographical features could absorb sound waves. I smiled. I tried to seem harmless, just a curious outsider chasing an interesting phenomenon. She finally gave me directions, but her final words stuck with me. "The land listens," she said. It dawned to answer back. "And what listens that carefully wants something more than your voice?" I drove deeper into the mountains. The road turned from asphalt to gravel to dirt. The trees grew thicker, older, their branches twisted into shapes that seemed deliberately unsettling. The afternoon light struggled to penetrate the canopy, creating a perpetual twilight that made my headlights necessary even though it was only 3 in the afternoon. The Hollow sat at the end of a forgotten logging road, surrounded by hills so steep they seemed to lean inward, like walls closing around a secret. I parked my truck and stepped out into the most disturbing silence I'd ever experienced. Complete, total, absolute. My footsteps made no sound on the fallen leaves. The wind moved through the trees but created no whisper, no rustle. When I slammed my truck door, the sound collapsed instantly, swallowed by something invisible and terrifying. I could feel the silence pressing against my eardrums, a physical weight that made my head ache. I brought professional equipment, shotgun microphones, digital recorders, devices sensitive enough to pick up a moth's wings from 20 feet away. I set up my gear in the center of the Hollow, a roughly circular clearing maybe 200 feet across, surrounded by ancient oaks and hickories that looked like they'd been standing since before America was colonized. The first test was simple. I clapped my hands. Nothing, not even the sharp crack of palm against palm. The sound started, I felt it, but it never reached my ears. It was like clapping underwater, except the suffocation was in the air itself. My recording equipment showed flat lines. Complete silence. Impossible silence. I shouted. I screamed. I fired my voice into the trees with every ounce of breath in my lungs, and the sound evaporated before it could travel 3 feet. The Hollow swallowed it completely, and swallowing implies digestion, implies something that takes what you give and makes it part of itself. That is when the fear started creeping in. I am a rational man. I understand physics, but standing in that Hollow, watching my breath cloud in the October cold while producing absolutely no sound, feeling the silence wrap around me like something alive and aware, my scientific explanations started crumbling. The locals said the land listened. If it listened, what did it hear? I spent an hour trying different experiments. I dropped rocks. I snapped branches. I played music from my phone. Every sound died instantly, absorbed by the hungry quiet that filled the Hollow like invisible water. My equipment picked up nothing except my own heartbeat and breathing, internal sounds that apparently didn't interest whatever was listening. As the afternoon light began to fail, I noticed something else. The trees around the hollow, this perimeter, were dead on the side facing inward. Not brown or diseased, dead, gray and lifeless, as if something had drained them slowly over decades or centuries. The bark hung in strips like peeling skin. The branches on the inner side were skeletal, twisted, reaching toward the center of the clearing like fingers trying to grasp something they could never quite touch. I should have left then. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to pack my equipment and drive back to Pittsburgh and forget I ever heard of the dead mouth. But I'm stubborn. I'm curious. I wanted answers. I decided to stay until dark, just to see what happened when night fell in a place where sound went to die. The darkness came fast in the mountains, rushing down the hillsides like black water filling a bowl. I set up a lantern, and the light seemed wrong in the silence, too bright, too harsh, emphasizing the wrongness of a world without ambient noise. No insects, no birds, no wind sound, nothing but my breathing and the pounding of my heart, which was getting faster. That is when I noticed the shapes. At first, I thought they were shadows, tricks of the lantern light playing across the dead trees. But shadows don't move independently. Shadows don't to detach from the things that cast them and drift through the darkness like smoke given purpose. There were dozens of them, circling the hollow as perimeter, never entering the clearing but staying just beyond my light's reach. Dark shapes roughly human-sized, moving with an unsettling smoothness that made my skin crawl. I couldn't make out details. They were absences more than presences, holes in the darkness that were somehow darker still. I grabbed my lantern and pointed it directly at the nearest shape. It stopped moving. It turned toward me, and though it had no face, no features I could distinguish, I knew with absolute certainty that it was looking at me. Then it opened its mouth. I saw the gesture even though I couldn't see details. A yawning darkness within darkness. And from that impossible mouth came a sound I recognized. My own voice. My own scream from earlier. The one I thrown into the hollow when I was testing the acoustics. But it was wrong, distorted, played backwards and forwards simultaneously, layered and twisted until it sounded like a chorus of dying things, like every frightened noise a human throat could make compressed into one horrifying wail. The other shapes joined in, dozens of mouths opening in the darkness, dozens of sounds pouring out. Not just my sounds, sounds that were old, that belonged to people who visited the hollow years ago, decades ago, maybe centuries ago. Screams and sobs and prayers and pleas, all of them corrupted, all of them transformed into something that made my mind want to shut down rather than process what I was hearing. The hollow had been listening for a very long time, and now it was speaking back. I ran. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I grabbed my lantern and ran toward my truck, leaving thousands of dollars of equipment behind, focused only on escape. My footsteps made no sound, but I could hear the chorus behind me growing louder, spreading, the shapes flowing down from the perimeter toward the center of the hollow where I had been standing. They were fast, impossibly fast. I could feel them closing in, could sense them reaching for me with appendages I couldn't see, trying to pull me back into that hungry silence where sounds went to be stored, to be twisted, to be replayed in ways that would drive anyone listening slowly insane. I reached my truck. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. The shapes were surrounding the vehicle now, pressing against the windows, their darkness so complete it made the night beyond them seem bright by comparison. The engine turned over. The sound was normal, beautiful. Outside the hollow, physics still worked the way physics should work. I drove. I drove faster than I'd ever driven on a mountain road at night, barely seeing the curves, not caring about the drop-offs on either side, thinking only about distance, about getting away from that place where silence wasn't just the absence of sound but the presence of something else, something that collected voices and screams and prayers and stored them like specimens, like trophies, like food. I made it back to Ashford just before midnight. The gas station was closed, but I sat in the parking lot under the streetlights, my whole body shaking, my mind trying to process what I experienced. I never went back. I never will go back. But sometimes, late at night, when the world around me gets very quiet, I hear something in that silence. A whisper, a suggestion of voices that don't belong to anyone living. And I wonder if the hollow let me go, or if it kept something. A recording, an echo, a piece of my voice that it is saving for some future visitor who needs to understand why the locals avoid that place, why they warn outsiders, Why they know that land which listens too carefully is land that has learned to hunger. The dead mouth is still there, still listening, still collecting. And somewhere in that darkness, stored in whatever passes for memory in a place older and stranger than human understanding, my scream is waiting. Twisted, distorted, ready to be played back for the next fool who thinks science can explain everything, who believes that frightening things only exist in stories, who doesn't understand that some silences are not empty. Some silences are full. Story 2. Cabin without a door. I need to tell you what happened in my grandfather's cabin before someone else finds it. Before someone else makes the same mistake I did. Because there are things worse than dying alone in the woods. And I learned that the hard way. The cabin has been in my family for 4 generations. My great-grandfather built it in 1947 in the Cascade Mountains, deep enough that you lose cell service 3 miles before you reach the turnoff. Every man in my family spent time there. My father, my uncles, all of them came back different. Quieter. They never talked about what they saw, but I noticed how they flinch at certain sounds. How they never wanted to go back. I am 42 years old. I thought I heard all the family secrets, but nobody told me about the door. The cabin sat empty for 7 years after my grandfather died. When my aunt handed me the keys last October, she held my wrist tight and said something strange. She said the cabin was mine now, but I had to promise to never try fixing what was broken. I laughed it off. I figured she meant the plumbing or the roof. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about everything. The drive up took 6 hours. The forest got thicker with every mile, the trees pressing closer to the narrow dirt road like they wanted to swallow it completely. By the time I reached the cabin, twilight had turned the woods into something dark and hostile. The headlights caught the structure in their beam, and my first thought was how small it looked. How vulnerable. Then I saw the door. Or rather, I saw where the door should have been. The frame was there, sturdy and square, but the door itself hung at an angle, the top hinge torn completely away from the wood. It swayed slightly in the wind, creaking with each movement. The sound was unsettling, rhythmic, like breathing. I grabbed my flashlight and approached. The door was heavy oak, at least 3 inches thick. The kind of door you need an axe to break through. But the hinge hadn't been forced or broken. It had been torn out from the inside, the screws ripped straight through solid wood. The metal was twisted, bent outward like something massive had pushed against it with incredible force. That should have been my first warning. That should have sent me back to my truck. But stubborn. Always have been. I convinced myself it was weather damage or maybe a bear. I stepped through the doorway into the darkness beyond. The smell hit me first. Not decay or mold like I expected. It was something else, something organic but wrong. Like meat left in a freezer for too long. That strange chemical smell of things preserved past their time. The flashlight beam cut through the shadows, revealing a simple one-room interior. A bed in the corner, a cast iron stove, a table with 2 chairs. Everything covered in dust except for one thing. The floor in front of the door was clean. Completely clean. Like something had been pacing there. Back and forth, wearing the dust away over time. I set my bags down and tried to rehang the door. It was impossible. The frame was too damaged. Every time I lifted the door into place, it would swing open again within seconds, that same creaking sound echoing through the cabin. After the 5th attempt, I gave up. I'd deal with it in the morning when I had proper tools and daylight. That first night, I built a fire in the stove and heated up some canned soup. The cabin warmed quickly, and I started to relax. I brought a book and a bottle of whiskey. I figured I'd spend the week doing some repairs, enjoying the silence, maybe sorting through my grandfather's things. Simple, peaceful. Then I heard the footsteps. They were soft at first. So soft I thought it was the wind or the trees settling. But they had rhythm, a pattern. They were coming from outside, circling the cabin. Slow, deliberate. When they reached the doorway, they stopped. I froze with my whiskey glass halfway to my lips. The fire crackled. The wind moaned through the trees, but those footsteps had gone silent in a way that felt intentional. Like something was standing just outside, listening. "Hello," I called out. My voice sounded weak, swallowed by the darkness beyond the open doorway. Nothing responded, but I could feel it there. That presence, that awful certainty that something was watching me from just beyond the reach of my firelight. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it at the doorway. The beam revealed nothing but trees and shadows and the narrow path leading away from the cabin. But when I turned the light off, I could have sworn I saw something move. Something tall and wrong that didn't quite fit the shape of the forest. The footsteps started again. They moved away from the door, circling back around the cabin. I counted them, 12 steps to reach the back wall, 8 steps along the side, 14 steps to return to the front. Then they stopped again at the doorway. This pattern repeated 7 times before I finally understood. Whatever was out there wasn't too random. It was testing, measuring, learning the dimensions of the cabin, learning where I was inside. I didn't sleep that first night. I sat in the corner farthest from the door with my grandfather, his old hunting rifle across my lap, watching that black rectangle of open space. The footsteps came and went in waves, sometimes vanishing for an hour, sometimes circling 3 or 4 times in quick succession. But they always stopped at the doorway, always paused there, as if something was deciding whether to come inside. Dawn came slow and gray. When sunlight finally reached the cabin, I felt brave enough to step outside and look around. The ground was soft from recent rain, perfect for holding tracks. I found them immediately. They were almost human. That was the most disturbing part. Almost. The shape was right. 5 toes, a heel, an arch. But they were too large. Each footprint was at least 14 inches long and pressed deep into the mud, suggesting something incredibly heavy. And the toes were wrong. They were too long, too spread out, like fingers trying to imitate feet. I followed the tracks around the cabin. They matched exactly what I heard. A perfect circle, with long pauses at the doorway. But there was something else, something that made my stomach turn cold. The tracks didn't lead away from the cabin. They didn't arrive from the forest or the road. They started at the doorway itself, as if whatever made them had walked out of the cabin, circled it, and then walked back inside. But I'd been inside all night. I'd been watching that door. Nothing had come through. I spent that day trying to convince myself there was a logical explanation. Maybe the tracks were old. Maybe I missed something in the dark. Maybe my exhaustion was making me paranoid. I drove into the nearest town, 30 miles down the mountain, and bought a heavy chain and padlock. I secured the door somehow. I make it stay closed. The hardware store owner was an old man with a scar across his left cheek. When I told him where I was staying, his expression changed. He got quiet. Then he asked me a strange question. "Your people know you up there?" "My aunt knows," I said. He nodded slowly. "Your grandfather was a good man, stronger than most. He lasted longer than the others." Lasted? The word felt wrong in my mouth. The old man wouldn't say more. He just rang up my purchase and told me to leave before dark. To never stay past dark. I didn't. Do you listen? I was determined to prove this was all superstition and fear. Mountain legend. The kind of scary stories people tell to entertain themselves in isolated places. I installed the chain that afternoon. I wrapped it through the door handle and secured it to a support beam with the heaviest padlock I could buy. The door couldn't swing open now. It was physically impossible. Then I waited for nightfall. The footsteps started earlier this time. The sun had barely set when I heard them begin their circuit. Around and around. But now there was a new sound. A low scratching against the wood, like something was running its fingers along the outside walls as it walked. When it reached the door, it stopped. I heard the chain rattle. Once, twice, then harder. The metal links scraped against each other as something pulled on the door from outside. The padlock held. The chain held. The door stayed closed. That was when the whispering started. I can to describe the voice properly. It wasn't male or female. It wasn't even really a voice at all. It was more like the memory of speech, like words that had been dead for so long they'd forgotten their own meaning. But I understood them anyway. "Let me in." 3 words, soft, patient. "Let me in." The temperature in the cabin dropped. My breath came out in white clouds. The fire in the stove was blazing, but I was suddenly colder than I'd ever been. "Let me in." Something pressed against the door. Something massive. The wood groaned. The chain pulled tight. But it held. Then the thing outside did something I'll never forget. It started to sound like me. "Help," it said in my voice. "Please help. I'm hurt. I'm scared. Please let me in." My own words. My own cadence. Perfect. Like it had recorded me somehow and was playing back my terror. I raised the rifle and pointed it at the door. "Get away from here," I shouted. I'll shoot you. I swear to God, I'll shoot. The whispering stopped. The footsteps stopped. For 5 full minutes, there was only silence and the hammering of my heart. Then I heard it move to the back wall. I heard it start to dig. The scratching was slow at first, methodical, like it was testing the wood, finding the weakest point. Then it got faster. Harder. I could hear splinters breaking. I could hear something gouging deep grooves into the logs. I ran to the back corner and pressed my ear against the wall. The scratching was right there, just inches away. And beneath it, I could hear something else. Breathing. Wet. Labored. Like lungs that had been damaged and healed wrong. "This cabin is mine," the thing said. Still using my voice. "It's always been mine. You were the one who doesn't belong." That is when I understood. This wasn't an animal. This wasn't some creature from the woods. This was something that had lived in the cabin before my family ever claimed it. Something that had been here when my great-grandfather built these walls. Something they built the cabin around, thinking they could contain it or hide it or maybe just ignore it. And the door that never stayed closed. That wasn't damage. That was intentional. It was meant to give this thing a way out. A way to leave and circle and satisfy whatever compulsion drove it. And every man in my family who stayed here had learned the same terrible truth. You don't lot what lives in the cabin. You let it out. I dropped the rifle and ran to the door. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely work the padlock. The key slipped. I dropped it, found it, tried again. Behind me, the scratching had become digging. Wood cracked. Something was coming through the wall. The padlock finally opened. I unwrapped the chain and let it fall. The door swung wide immediately, like it had been pushed. The scratching stopped. I stood there in the doorway, gasping, watching the forest. Nothing moved. The footsteps didn't start again. Whatever had been digging through the wall had gone silent. Then I felt it pass by me. Not touching, just moving through the space I occupied, like I was smoke. The temperature plunged again. My flashlight flickered. And in that stuttering light, I saw something. A shadow that was darker than the surrounding darkness. Taller than any human. It moved toward the trees with a gait that was almost right, but not quite. Like it was remembering how to walk. How to be shaped like a person. It disappeared into the forest. And the footsteps began their circuit around the cabin. I left that night. I didn't pack. I didn't take my grandfather's things. I got in my truck and drove down the mountain until I had cell service, and then I called my aunt. "You chained the door," she said. "It wasn't a question." "How did you know?" "Because your father did the same thing. And your uncle. And your grandfather. The first time he stayed there alone." Her voice was tired, heavy with old grief. "The cabin has rules. We don't talk about them because talking about them makes them real. But they were there. They've always been there." "What is it?" I asked. "What is living in that cabin?" She was quiet for a long time. Then she said something that keeps me awake at night. "Nothing is living there, honey. That's the problem. It died a long time ago, but it doesn't know how to leave. And every time someone tries to keep it locked in, it remembers what it is. It remembers it's angry. I sold the cabin last month. I didn't tell the buyer about the door. I know I should have. I know there's blood on my hands for that choice. But I was too scared, too desperate to be free of it. Yesterday, I got a call from the county sheriff. The new owner has been reported missing. They found his truck at the cabin. They found the door chained shut from the inside. And they found long scratches on every wall, spiraling toward the center of the room, like something had been trying to claw its way out of its own skin. They asked me if I knew anything, if my grandfather had ever mentioned problems at the property. I told them no. I lied. Because the truth is worse than any lie I could tell. The truth is that cabin should never have been built, should never have been claimed. And now something that should have stayed forgotten has been disturbed one too many times. Now it's looking for a new home. Now it's walking down the mountain. And I know exactly whose voice it will use when it knocks on someone's door in the dark. It will sound just like me. People learned early that not every road was meant to be traveled. Some paths were avoided, not because they were dangerous, but because they changed those who used them. Story 3. Road the Elders Avoided. I was 16 years old when I first heard about the road. It wasn't a scary story told around a campfire or some internet legend designed to frighten kids. It was something my grandfather mentioned once, almost offhandedly, while we were sitting on his porch in rural Kentucky. He said the elders in our town never drove it after dark. Not because of accidents or wildlife or bad conditions. Because, according to him, time behaved differently there. I laughed at him then. I didn't understand what he meant. And honestly, I didn't care. I was a teenager who thought horror was fake and danger was something that happened to other people. My grandfather just shrugged and changed the subject. but I noticed he never drove through that road when the sun started setting. Neither did my grandmother. Neither did anyone else in town over the age of 50. 20 years later, I found myself driving that same road at dusk. It was called County Road 47, cutting through the Appalachian Mountains like a scar through skin. I was coming back from a job interview in a neighboring county, and my GPS insisted this was the fastest road home. The highway had been under construction, and I was already running late. My wife was waiting for me. My kids were waiting for me. I told myself I didn't believe in my grandfather. The stories about time behaving strangely anywhere. I told myself it was just a road. The first thing I noticed when I turned onto it was the silence. Not peaceful silence. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring because there is no sound at all. No birds. No wind through the trees. No distant traffic from other cars. Just the low hum of my engine and the occasional crunch of gravel beneath my tires. The forest on both sides was thick and dark, even though the sun hadn't completely set yet. The trees seemed to lean toward the road, their branches intertwining overhead like the fingers of skeletal hands. I checked my phone for the time, 6:45. My house was maybe 20 minutes away if I drove straight through. The road curved deeper into the mountains, twisting in ways that didn't seem natural. Every bend seemed to surprise me, even though I was watching the pavement ahead. The curves were tight and frequent, and I found myself slowing down without meaning to. Something about the road made me feel like I shouldn't go fast. Something about it made me feel watched. Then I saw the first sign of something being wrong. My odometer read that I had driven 3 miles. According to my GPS, I should have been 8 miles along County Road 47. The numbers didn't match. I blinked and looked again, but the discrepancy was unmistakable. I had traveled less distance than my location should have indicated. I chalked it up to a GPS error and kept driving. 5 minutes later, I checked again. The odometer now showed 7 miles. The GPS showed I was at mile 9. The gap was widening, not shrinking. That unsettling feeling from before started growing into something darker, something creepier. The word my grandfather used came back to me. Strangely. Time behaved strangely here, but this wasn't about time. This was about distance, about space warping in a way that shouldn't be possible. The sun dipped lower. The forest became darker. My headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the blackness, and beyond that tunnel was nothing but eerie emptiness. I passed a mailbox nailed to a wooden post. The numbers were so faded and rust-eaten that I couldn't read them. There was no house visible from the road, no driveway leading off into the trees. Just the mailbox, like a marker for something that had been forgotten. I checked the time again, 7:15. I should have been almost home by now. According to the clock on my dashboard, I had been driving for 30 minutes. That should have been plenty of time. But my GPS was still showing me as being in the middle of County Road 47, with at least 10 more miles to go. My odometer and my GPS were telling completely different stories now, and neither of them made sense. I slowed down even more. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. The darkness outside my car felt thick, as if it had weight and presence. The trees lining the road seemed closer than before. The road itself seemed to narrow with each curve. I began to understand what my grandfather meant. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just a road through the mountains. Then I saw the house. It appeared suddenly on my right, set back from the road just far enough that my headlights barely reached it. The structure was old, maybe from the 1800s. The wood was dark with age, nearly black in some places. The windows were empty sockets, completely devoid of glass or light. The roof sagged in the middle, as if something heavy had landed on it years ago and never been removed. The entire building looked like it was held together by rust and habit and nothing else. But what made my skin crawl wasn't the condition of the house. It was that there was smoke coming from the chimney. A thin column of pale gray smoke rose into the dark sky. Someone was inside. Someone was living in that terrifying, decaying structure, maintaining a fire against the growing cold of evening. The house looked abandoned and dangerous and thoroughly wrong, but the smoke meant it wasn't tea. The smoke meant something was in there. Something was keeping that fire alive in a place where nothing should be alive at all. I drove faster. My car responded to my fear, and I let it. The road twisted and curved, and I followed it blindly, not paying attention to the landscape anymore, just wanting to get past this house, past this section of road, back to normal civilization where things made sense. The odometer was now showing 13 miles. My GPS showed mile 14. We were getting closer, at least, but the time made no sense anymore. I looked at the clock, 7:33. I should have been home by 7 o'clock at the latest. I should have been sitting at my dinner table. Instead, I was still in the darkness, still in this eerie forest, still on this road that the elders refused to travel after dark. I began to understand why. The road started doing something that made my terrifying realization complete. It seemed to curve back on itself. Shapes I had seen before appeared again in my headlights. The same twisted trees, the same broken fence posts, the same rocks jutting from the shoulder. I was seeing repeated landscape, which shouldn't be possible unless I was going in a circle. But I wasn't turning the wheel that way. I was going forward, straight forward, the way the road was going. And yet the road was bringing me back to places I had already passed. My fear became something crystalline and sharp. My hands were shaking. I gripped the wheel harder, and I pressed down on the accelerator. My car jumped forward, and the speedometer climbed. 50 miles per hour, 60. The curves came faster now, more frightening, more disorienting. The forest blurred around me. The darkness pressed against my windows like a living thing trying to get inside. I came around one more curve, and there it was again. The house with the smoking chimney. But this time, I was approaching it from the opposite direction. The chimney was on the left side of the house instead of the right. The windows faced the road the way they should face if I were coming from the south instead of the north. I had somehow driven in a full circle, or the road had circled around me. My odometer now read 23 miles. My GPS showed mile 16. The time was 7:58. 53 minutes on a road that should have taken 20. I floored the accelerator. My car protested, the engine straining as I pushed it faster than it wanted to go. The speedometer needle climbed to 70, then 80. The road was a blur of headlight and darkness. I wasn't paying attention to where I was going anymore. I was just trying to get away from that house, away from the impossible distances, away from the way time was stretching and space was folding in on itself. The curves came even faster. I took them too sharp, felt my tires slip slightly on the gravel. My car skidded, and for a moment, I thought I was going to lose control, going to wrap around one of those twisted trees and end up like the house, dark and broken and slowly sinking back into the earth. But I didn't crash. Instead, the road straightened out. And suddenly, impossibly, I could see lights ahead. The scattered lights of a small town, street lights and house lights, and the commercial glow of the convenience store on the highway. I was out of the forest. I was out of the twisted roads and the crushing darkness and the impossible space that had been trying to keep me trapped. I had made it through. I drove straight to the highway and didn't look back. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely steer. My shirt was soaked through with sweat. My heart was still hammering against my ribs like it was trying to escape my body. I checked the time as I merged onto the main road. 8:15. The drive that should have taken 20 minutes had taken almost 40. When I finally pulled into my driveway, my wife came out to meet me. She asked why I was so late. I started to tell her about the road, about the impossible distances, about the house with the smoking chimney. But the words caught in my throat. How could I explain something that didn't make sense? How could I describe a phenomenon that violated every law of physics and space and time? So I just told her the interview had run long, and I had gotten stuck in traffic. But I couldn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about what my grandfather had said. The elders never drove that road after dark because time behaved strangely there. He hadn't been talking about time at all. He had been talking about something bigger than time, something that existed in the space between points, in the stretches of road where distance became meaningless and direction became a suggestion rather than a certainty. The next morning, I drove to my grandfather's house. He was in his garden, pruning dead branches from his tomato plants. I asked him what he knew about County Road 47. He stopped what he was doing, and he looked at me with an expression of such profound sadness that I felt my stomach drop. He asked me if I had driven it after dark. I nodded. He set down his pruning shears, and he told me something that made my blood run cold. He said that no one who drove that road after sunset ever truly came home. They arrived at their destinations. Yes, they showed up at their houses and their jobs and their lives. But something about them was never quite the same. They had extra time that didn't match the world. They had seen things that the world didn't want them to see. They carried something back from that road that the rest of us couldn't quite perceive. He asked me how long I thought I had been driving. I told him 40 minutes. He told me I was wrong. He said that my wife had called his house 3 hours after I left for the interview. She was frantic. The interview location was only 30 minutes away. She had been trying to reach me for an hour with no answer. He had called the police, and they had started searching. They drove that same road looking for me, but they didn't find my car. It was like I had vanished into the mountains. But then I had arrived home. My wife said I pulled into the driveway at 6:37 in the evening. My interview had ended at 5:15. The drive was 30 minutes. I should have been home by 6 at the latest. But somewhere between the interview location and my house, I had lost almost an hour. The police couldn't explain it. My wife couldn't explain it. And when I looked at my phone, there were 3 missed calls from my wife and 2 from my grandfather, all timestamped before 6 o'clock. Before I supposedly arrived home, I had no memory of receiving those calls. I had no memory of my phone ringing at all. My grandfather told me something else then, something that haunts me more than anything else he said. He told me that the road doesn't affect everyone equally. Some people drive through it and lose a few minutes. Some lose an hour or more, but all of them lose something. Some of them lose time. Some of them lose parts of themselves. Some of them lose the ability to fully exist in the normal world anymore. He asked me if I could remember every moment of my drive through that road. I couldn't. There were gaps, stretches that seemed to blur together, times when I wasn't sure what I had seen or what I had imagined. The house with the smoking chimney seemed to exist and not exist at the same time in my memory. Clear and vivid one moment, hazy and dreamlike the next. That was 9 years ago. I'm telling you this story now because I need someone to know. I need someone to understand what County Road 47 really is. It's not just a road through the mountains where time behaves strangely. It is a place where the rules dawn to work the way they are supposed to. It is a place that exists in the cracks between where we are and where we are supposed to be. The elders avoided it because they understood something fundamental about the world that most of us never learn. There are places where normal physics doesn't apply. There are roads where distance is negotiable and time is flexible, and the distance between departure and arrival can stretch into something impossible and terrifying. I never drove that road again. I take the long way around now, even if it adds an hour to my drive time. My wife doesn't know why I insisted on that route change. And I haven't told her. She doesn't know that I lost an hour that night in a way that still doesn't make sense, in a way that suggests something fundamentally wrong about reality itself. But sometimes, late at night when I can sleep, I wonder about that house. I wonder if it is still there, if that thin column of smoke is still rising from its chimney, if whatever lives inside is still maintaining its fire. I wonder if there are others like me who drove that road and came back changed, carrying impossible time in their pockets like spare change they can never spend. And I wonder, sometimes, if I actually made it through that road at all, or if I am still driving it. If maybe, just maybe, I never actually left, and everything since that night, my wife, my kids, my house, my job, is just what the road shows people who get trapped inside it. A simulation of home, a nightmare wearing the face of my own life. Because that is the most terrifying part of County Road 47. Once you drive it after dark, you can never be completely sure that you actually escaped. Story 4. Light above the tree line. I should have known something was wrong the moment I saw the missing persons flyer taped to the gas pump. Not because missing people are rare in rural America, but because the face staring back at me was my own. Let me back up. My name is David Marsh, and 3 weeks ago I made the worst decision of my life. I took a shortcut through the Appalachian back roads, trying to shave 2 hours off my drive from Tennessee to Virginia. The highway had been jammed with construction, and my GPS kept rerouting me deeper into mountain country. You know that feeling when technology fails you and suddenly you reach somewhere that doesn't quite feel like it belongs to the modern world anymore? That is where I found myself as the sun started dropping behind the ridgeline. The road narrowed to one lane. Dense forest pressed in from both sides, the kind of woods that look black even in daylight. My phone lost signal around mile marker 37. I remember that number because it was the last marker I ever saw. After that, the road just kept winding higher into the mountains, unmarked and seemingly endless. That is when I first noticed the light. It appeared in my rearview mirror, a pale glow hovering above the tree line behind me. Not quite white, not quite blue. It pulsed slowly, like something breathing. I figured it was a cell tower or maybe some kind of radio antenna. But when I checked my phone, still no signal. Still nothing but that dead screen and the growing darkness outside. The disturbing part came when I tried to drive away from it. No matter which turn I took, no matter how many times the road twisted through those mountains, the light stayed exactly the same distance behind me. Always hovering above the trees, always following. I could see it reflected in my mirrors, casting strange shadows across the empty road. My hands started sweating on the steering wheel. My heart hammered against my ribs. This wasn't normal. This wasn't right. I pushed the accelerator harder, taking curves too fast, my tires squealing on the worn asphalt. The light never fell behind. It never got closer. It just hovered there like some pale eye watching my every move. Then my engine started making a sound it had never made before. A grinding, almost organic noise, like metal screaming. The temperature gauge spiked into the red zone. I had no choice. I had to stop. That is how I found Ridgeway. The town appeared around a sharp bend, so suddenly it felt like it materialized out of nothing. A cluster of weathered buildings hunched against the mountainside. A single stoplight swaying in the wind, though I saw no intersection that required it. A diner with a flickering neon sign that read, "This place," though half the letters were dark. And a motel, the kind you see in horror movies, with a gravel parking lot and rooms that opened directly to the outside. I pulled into the motel lot, my engine hissing and steaming. The light above the ridge was still there, now positioned directly over the town. It illuminated the tree line with that eerie, pulsing glow. Nobody else seemed to notice it. A few locals walked along the sidewalk, moving slow, their faces hollow and tired. They glanced at my car but didn't wave or nod. Just stared with empty eyes before continuing on their way. The motel office smelled like mildew and old cigarettes. An elderly woman sat behind the counter, her skin so pale it looked almost translucent under the fluorescent lights. She smiled when I entered, but her eyes remained cold and distant. "Room for the night?" she asked. Her voice sounded like wind through dead leaves. "My car broke down," I explained. "I just need a place to stay until I can get a mechanic to look at it in the morning." "Morning?" she repeated, as if the word was foreign. "Yes, morning will come. It always does, eventually." The way she said it made my skin crawl, but I was exhausted, stranded, and had no other options. I took the key she offered. Room 7, around back. The room was exactly what you'd expect. Thin carpet with mysterious stains, a bed that sagged in the middle, a television that only picked up static on most channels. But it had a lock on the door, and right then, that was all I cared about. I locked myself inside, closed the curtains, and tried to ignore the pale light I could still see through the fabric, casting ghostly patterns across the walls. I attempted to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I felt like something was watching me. Not from outside the window, from somewhere closer, somewhere inside the room itself. The shadows in the corners seemed too dark, too thick. They moved when I wasn't looking directly at them, shifting, breathing, waiting. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside my door. Slow, deliberate steps on the gravel. They stopped right outside room 7. I held my breath, staring at the door, waiting for a knock that never came. Instead, I heard whispering, multiple voices, all speaking in unison, words I couldn't quite make out. The sound made my teeth ache and my stomach turn. Then, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the footsteps moved on. I didn't sleep that night. When morning finally arrived, gray and overcast, I left the room and walked toward the diner. That is when I saw the flyer, my face printed in black and white, with bold letters above it. Missing. And below, last seen 3 months ago in Ridgeway. If you have any information, please contact the sheriff, this office. 3 months ago. But I had only arrived last night. My hands shook as I tore the flyer down. This had to be a mistake. Some kind of sick joke. Maybe someone who looked like me had gone missing. Maybe I had a doppelganger. But when I looked closer at the photo, I saw the scar on my left eyebrow. The one I got when I was 12 falling off my bike. I saw the shirt I was wearing right now. The same shirt. I ran back to the motel office. The old woman was gone. The entire office was empty, covered in dust, like nobody had been there in years. The guest book lay open on the counter. I flipped through the pages. Every single entry was the same name, written in the same handwriting. David Marsh. Pages and pages of my name, dating back decades. Panic set in hard. I bolted to my car, praying it would start. The engine turned over on the first try, smooth as ever, as if nothing had ever been wrong with it. I threw the car into drive and peeled out of the parking lot, spraying gravel behind me. I didn't care which direction I went. I just needed to leave this terrifying, impossible place. But here is the thing about Ridgeway. You don't leave unless it wants you to. Every road I took led me right back to that same stoplight. That same diner. That same motel. The town looped in on itself like some kind of horrifying maze. I drove for hours, burning through half a tank of gas, watching the same buildings pass by over and over again. The locals I saw were always the same people, wearing the same clothes, walking the same roads. Like actors in a play, repeating their scenes endlessly. And above it all, the light kept watching. I finally stopped the car in the middle of the main street, breathing hard, my mind racing through impossible explanations. Was I dead? Was this hell? Had I lost my mind somewhere back on that mountain road? That is when I saw him, standing in the middle of the intersection. A man in a sheriff's uniform, his face hidden beneath the brim of his hat. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, facing my car. Slowly, he raised one arm and pointed toward the ridge line, toward the light. I understood then. The light wasn't just watching. It was waiting for me to try to leave for good, waiting for me to make that final attempt. Because everyone who had ever tried to leave Ridgeway for good, everyone who had truly wanted to escape this cursed place, they all saw the light. And they all ended up right back here, trapped, forever. I drove toward the ridge line. I don't know why. Maybe it was the only choice left. Maybe I needed to confront whatever was up there. The road climbed steep and winding, branches scraping against my car, the forest growing denser and darker with every turn. The light grew brighter as I approached, pulsing faster now, almost excited. At the top of the ridge, the road ended at a small clearing. I got out of the car. The light hovered directly above me, so bright I had to shield my eyes. And in that light, I saw them. Dozens of faces, hundreds, all the people who had tried to leave, all the missing persons whose flyers probably lined the walls of that motel office. They stared down at me with hollow eyes, mouths open in silent screams, suspended in that pale glow like insects in amber. And I realized the horrible truth. The light didn't just watch people leave. It collected them. Every soul that tried to escape Ridgeway for good became part of it. Became part of the thing that kept the town alive. Kept it hidden. Kept it feeding. I ran back to my car, but the engine wouldn't start. The light descended closer, and I could feel it pulling at something inside me. Not my body, something deeper. My memories started to blur. My sense of time began to unravel. I couldn't remember how long I'd been in Ridgeway. Days? Weeks? Months? Years? I looked at my hands and saw they were pale, translucent, like the old woman in the motel office. Like the locals walking those empty streets. I was becoming one of them. One of the ghosts trapped in this nightmare town, doomed to repeat the same day forever, waiting for the next traveler to arrive. That was 3 weeks ago, or maybe 3 months, or maybe 3 years. Time doesn't work right here anymore. I just stopped trying to leave. The light above the ridgeline still glows every night, still watches, still waits. Sometimes new cars pull into town, their drivers confused and frightened, asking about mechanics and mourning. I smile when I see them. I offer directions that lead nowhere. I watch them realize, slowly, what I learned too late. Nobody leaves Ridgeway. And if you ever find yourself on an unmarked mountain road, if you ever see a pale light hovering above the tree line, following you no matter where you turn, I have only one piece of advice. Don, to stop driving. Don, to stop for anything. Because once you stop, once you enter a town that shouldn't to exist on any map, you become part of something ancient and hungry. Something that has been trapping travelers for decades, maybe centuries. The light is always watching. The light is always waiting. And the light never forgets. Over time, families stopped asking questions. They learned that remembering was safer than understanding, and that some names were better left unspoken. Story 5. Valley that kept names. The terrifying thing about my grandmother, his funeral wasn't to her death. It was what everyone refused to say. I'm talking about her name, Sarah, a simple, beautiful name my grandmother had carried for 83 years. But standing at her graveside in that quiet valley in western Montana, not a single person spoke it aloud. Not the minister, not my father, not the 37 relatives who gathered under gray November skies to say goodbye. They called her other things. Mother, Grandma, her, the departed, but never Sarah. And when I whispered it, just once, just her name carried softly on my breath, every head turned toward me with expressions of pure horror. I am 47 years old. I work in insurance claims in Denver. I am divorced, no kids, and I hadn't been back to my father's hometown of Millerton Valley in over 20 years. I'd almost forgotten the place existed, tucked away in a forgotten corner of Montana where the mountains press close and the forest grows so thick that sunlight barely reaches the ground even at noon. The town had maybe 200 people when I was a kid. Now it was down to 73, according to the faded population sign at the valley's entrance. After the funeral, my father pulled me aside. His face was pale, his hands shaking as he gripped my arm with surprising strength for a man of 71. He told me we needed to talk. Alone, away from the others. We drove to the edge of town, to an old diner that had been there since the 1940s. Its neon sign flickering weakly in the growing darkness. The place was empty except for a waitress who looked at us with recognition and something else. Fear, maybe, or pity. My father ordered coffee neither of us would drink. Then he told me about the names. The valley kept them, he said. Every name spoken aloud with emotion, with meaning, with weight behind it. The land remembered, and once the land remembered, it could call those names back, could use them, could make the people who owned those names do things they wouldn't normally do, go places they wouldn't normally go, become something they weren't meant to become. I thought he lost his mind with grief. I told him so, as gently as I could. His response was to pull out his wallet and show me his driver's license. The name printed there wasn't the name I called him my entire life. The man I knew as Robert Fletcher was actually named Dennis Allen Morrison. He changed it legally 40 years ago, right after he married my mother and moved them both out of the valley. He never told her his real name. Never told me. Never spoke it aloud after leaving Millerton Valley, because speaking it would remind the land where he was, and the land had ways of reaching beyond its borders when it wanted something badly enough. I asked him what happened to people whose names the valley kept. He looked at me with eyes that had seen something no father should have to explain to his son. Something so disturbing and unsettling that even decades later, the memory made his hands shake. He told me about his sister, about Margaret. Margaret was 16 when she vanished. This was back in 1968. She'd been a normal teenager, rebellious and wild, always pushing boundaries the way kids do in small towns where nothing ever happens and everyone knows everyone. This business. She'd gotten into an argument with their mother, a screaming match that carried through their small house and out into the valley's quiet air. Margaret had shouted her own name repeatedly during that fight, emphasizing it, making it a weapon. I am Margaret. Margaret decides what Margaret does. You can't control Margaret anymore. That night, she disappeared from her locked bedroom. They found her 3 days later, walking along the highway at the valley's edge, speaking in a voice that wasn't quite hers anymore, saying her name over and over like a chant, like a prayer, like an incantation that had taken root in her throat and wouldn't let go. Margaret, 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 Margaret. She never stopped. Not when they brought her home. Not when they took her to doctors in Billings who couldn't explain what was wrong. Not when she stopped eating, stopped sleeping, just kept walking in circles and saying that single word in a voice that grew stranger and deeper with each repetition. She died 6 weeks later. Her last word was her own name, spoken in a voice my father swears belonged to the valley itself, using her mouth, using her lungs, using everything she was to speak itself into existence through her. After Margaret, the families in Millerton Valley made an agreement, a rule that everyone followed, that everyone taught their children, that kept them safe from whatever listened beneath the soil and inside the trees and within the strange silence that filled the spaces between houses. They stopped using names. Real names, anyway. They used nicknames, initials, descriptions, anything but the names their parents had given them, the names that carried weight in history and identity. Because identity was what the valley wanted. Identity was what it consumed. My father had broken the rule by leaving, by taking his real name with him beyond the valley, its borders. But he'd been lucky. The land had been distracted by others, by people who stayed, by people whose names it could collect and keep and eventually call back when it grew hungry for the particular flavor of human identity that only a spoken name could provide. I didn't believe him. How could I? I am a rational man. I deal with facts and figures and documented evidence. I told him he was grieving, that he needed to see someone, that the isolation of growing up in a place like Millerton Valley had obviously created some kind of mass delusion, some shared psychosis that made sense to the people trapped inside it but was clearly insane to anyone looking from the outside. He nodded slowly, like he expected my response, like he had the same doubts once, a long time ago, before he learned better. Then he told me I needed to leave the valley immediately. Tonight, before midnight, because I'd spoken my grandmother's name at the funeral, and the valley had heard me, and now it knew there was someone present who didn't follow the rules, someone who didn't understand the danger, someone whose own name might be easier to take because I didn't believe enough to protect it. I refused. I rented a room at the valley, its only motel, a sad little place with 8 units and a flickering vacancy sign that looked like it hadn't been turned off in years. I was tired. I was frustrated with my father. It was disturbing paranoia. I wanted to sleep and then drive back to Denver in the morning and try to forget this whole creepy experience. That was my first mistake. My second was saying my own name aloud when I checked into the motel. The owner, a woman probably in her 60s with gray hair pulled back tight and eyes that had stopped showing emotion decades ago, actually flinched when I introduced myself. She wrote something in her register that wasn't what I said, handed me a key to Unit 5, and told me to keep my door locked and my windows closed, no matter what I heard outside. The room was exactly what you'd expect from a dying motel in a dying town. Thin carpet with stains that told stories I didn't want to know. A bed with a mattress that sagged in the middle. A bathroom with rust stains in the sink and a mirror that seemed darker than mirrors should be, like it reflected shadows more accurately than light. I tried to sleep. I really did. But the silence in Millerton Valley was wrong. It wasn't peaceful. It wasn't natural. It was the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes you strain to hear something, anything, just to prove the world still existed beyond the walls of your temporary shelter. Around midnight, I heard the whispers. They came from outside my window, soft and insistent, like voices carried on wind, except there was no wind. Just the heavy stillness of a November night in a valley where the air itself seemed to be holding its breath. The whispers were saying names. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Names from different eras, different decades, spoken in voices that ranged from children to elderly, from terrified to resigned, from living to something that definitely wasn't alive anymore. And among those names, repeated more frequently than the others, I heard my grandmother's name. Sarah, 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 but it wasn't being spoken in her voice. It was being spoken in mine. The exact tone and inflection I used at the graveside when I whispered it without thinking, without understanding the rules that kept people safe in this terrifying place. I went to the window. I shouldn't have, but fear makes you do stupid things, makes you seek confirmation of what you re-experiencing even when every instinct screams at you to hide, to run, to pretend you somewhere else, anywhere else. The parking lot outside was filled with people. No, not people. Shapes that were almost people, that wore the rough outline of human forms like badly fitting clothes. They stood perfectly still, facing my window, and every single one of them had their mouths open, had darkness spilling from those mouths like liquid shadow, and from that darkness came the names, the endless litany of identities that the valley had collected over its long and hungry existence. Then they started saying my name, my full name, my real name, the one I stupidly spoken aloud to the motel owner, giving it freely to a place that collected such things like other places collect taxes or rainfall. The shapes moved closer. They didn't. They walked so much as flow. Their almost human bodies rippling across the parking lot like vertical water, their mouths never closing, their voices never stopping, just saying my name over and over in my own voice, in my father's voice, in my grandmother's voice, in voices belonging to every person who had ever known me and spoken my name with any kind of emotion or meaning. I backed away from the window. I grabbed my car keys. I had some dim idea that I could run, could drive away before whatever was outside reached my door, before the valley could finish whatever process it had started when I carelessly offered up my identity. But when I opened the door to Unit 5, the shapes were already there, filling the space between my room and my truck, flowing around the corners of the motel building, emerging from the darkness with their mouths open and my name pouring out like something being vomited from the earth itself. I slammed the door. I locked it. I pushed the dresser against it even though I knew, somehow, that physical barriers wouldn't matter. That this wasn't about keeping things out, but about keeping myself in, about the valley exerting its claim on what I'd given it. The walls started whispering. Not the people outside, the actual walls, the ceiling, the floor. Every surface in that motel room had my name soaking into it like water into rotting wood, spreading, growing stronger, until the room itself was saying who I was, claiming ownership of my identity with every repetition. I did the only thing I could think of. I started denying it. I started saying it wasn't my name, that I was someone else, that the valley had made a mistake, had grabbed onto something that didn't belong to me anymore. And slowly, painfully, while the shapes pressed against my windows and door and the walls chanted my identity like a curse, I convinced myself I was someone different, someone new, someone the valley couldn't claim because the name they were using didn't fit anymore, had never fit, was just a label I worn temporarily but could shed like old skin. The sun rose around 6 in the morning. The whispers stopped. The shapes outside my window were gone, leaving no trace they ever existed except for strange marks in the parking lot gravel, patterns that looked almost like writing in a language I didn't recognize and didn't want to learn. I left Militant Valley that morning. I didn't say goodbye to my father. I didn't check out of the motel. I just drove, watching the mountains recede in my rearview mirror, feeling the weight of the valley, its attention slowly fade as I put distance between myself and that cursed, hungry place. I changed my name legally 3 weeks later. New first name, new middle name, new identity on every document I could access. The person who went to that valley doesn't exist anymore. At least not officially. Not in any way that matters. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone and the world gets very quiet, I hear whispers. Just faint suggestions of my old name, the one the valley tried to keep, spoken in voices that sound like relatives I've never met and ancestors I'll never know. All of them calling for someone who used to be me. All of them serving a place that collects identities the way other places collect stories or memories or souls. My father died last year. Heart attack, sudden and final. I didn't go to the funeral. I couldn't risk returning. Couldn't risk the valley recognizing something in my face or voice or presence that would remind it of the name it almost kept, the identity it almost consumed. The valley is still there, still quiet, still keeping its collection of names locked in the soil and stone and silence. And somewhere in that collection, half claimed and never quite released, is an identity that used to belong to me, waiting for the day I'd be foolish enough to speak it aloud again, to remind the land what it lost and give it another chance to finish what it started. Some places remember, some places listen, and some places keep what they re-given forever. Story 6. Whispers beneath the floorboards. The house my wife inherited sits on 14 acres in the Appalachian foothills, and I heard the whispers my very first night there. I need you to understand something before I continue. I am a rational man. I fix engines for a living. I believe in what I can touch and measure. But what happened in that house changed everything I thought I knew about reality. The property came from her grandmother, a woman who lived alone for 43 years after her husband disappeared. When the lawyer handed us the keys, he mentioned something disturbing. He said the grandmother had left specific instructions. We were never to enter the crawl space beneath the house, never to investigate sounds coming from below the floorboards, and most importantly, never to respond if we heard our names called from underneath. My wife laughed it off as old mountain superstition. I should have paid attention to the fear in that lawyer's eyes. The house was beautiful in daylight. Built in 1889, it had high ceilings and wide pine floors that creaked with character. But there was something off about the foundation. The house sat elevated on stone pillars, leaving a 3-foot crawl space underneath. Every room had gaps between the floorboards, some wide enough to see through into the darkness below. My wife wanted to seal them. I told her we would. I wish to God we had done it that first day. We moved in on a Saturday in late September. The isolation hit me immediately. Our nearest neighbor was 4 miles down a winding dirt road. No cell service, no internet, just endless forest pressing in from all sides and the constant sound of wind through the trees. By nightfall, I felt the weight of that silence, the kind of eerie quiet that makes you aware of every small sound. I woke at 2 in the morning to whispers. They were soft at first, barely audible over my own breathing. I thought it was the wind or maybe the house settling. Old places make noise. Everyone knows that. But as I lay there in the darkness, I realized these sounds had rhythm. They had pattern. They were words, spoken so quietly I couldn't quite make them out, rising up through the gaps in the floorboards beside our bed. I nudged my wife awake. She listened for a moment, then shook her head. She couldn't hear anything. She told me I was exhausted from the move and went back to sleep. But I heard them, and as the night wore on, they got louder. By 3 in the morning, I could make out individual voices. There were at least 4 distinct speakers, maybe more. They spoke in overlapping whispers, creating a sound like static, but occasionally a word would break through clear and sharp. Help, lost, cold, hungry. The voices sounded human but wrong somehow, like recordings played at the wrong speed or filtered through water. I got out of bed and walked through the house, trying to locate the source. The whispers followed me. In the kitchen, they rose through the gaps near the stove. In the hallway, they seemed to come from every crack and seam. And when I stood in the living room, directly over the widest gap in the floorboards, I heard something that froze my blood. My name, clear as day, my full name, spoken in a voice I almost recognized. It sounded like my father, who had been dead for 6 years. The same rough timbre, the same slight accent, but underneath it was something else, something mimicking human speech without quite understanding it. I grabbed a flashlight and went to the back porch where the crawlspace entrance was located. The door was small, maybe 2 feet square, held shut with a rusty padlock. I shined my light through the gaps around the frame. The beam penetrated maybe 6 feet before the darkness swallowed it completely. But in that brief illumination, I saw the ground beneath the house. It was covered in scratches, deep gouges in the dirt, forming patterns I couldn't understand. Symbols or maybe words written in some language I didn't recognize. And there were objects down there, piles of them, clothing, shoes, tools, all arranged in careful circles around the support pillars. The whispering suddenly stopped. Complete silence. Then I heard movement, something large shifting in that crawl space, disturbing the objects, scraping against the stone pillars. My flashlight beam caught a glimpse of something pale moving through the shadows. Something that pulled itself along the ground with long arms that bent at too many angles. I ran inside and locked every door. I woke my wife and told her everything. She was skeptical until we returned to the bedroom and she finally heard them too. The whispers had returned, louder than before, and now they were saying both our names. We didn't sleep the rest of that night. We sat in the living room with every light on, listening to those voices call to us from below. As dawn approached, the whispers faded to nothing. By sunrise, the house was silent again. Normal. In the morning light, it was easy to convince ourselves we imagined it. That fear and exhaustion had played tricks on our minds. But that night, they came back, and they brought something new. Around midnight, the scratching started. It began at the corners of the house and worked inward. Long, deliberate scrapes against the underside of the floorboards, like fingernails on wood. The sound moved through the house in patterns, tracing the layout of each room. Kitchen, hallway, bathroom, bedroom, whatever was underneath was mapping the space. Learning where we slept, where we spent our time. My wife wanted to leave. I convinced her to stay. I told her we could call someone in the morning. An exterminator or maybe the police. Someone who could explain this rationally. But I knew I was lying to both of us. This wasn't rats or raccoons. This was something that knew our names. On the third night, I made a terrible mistake. I looked through the floorboard gaps. We were eating dinner when I noticed movement in my peripheral vision. Something pale flickering in the darkness below the kitchen table. I got down on my hands and knees and pressed my face to the widest crack. My wife told me not to. She begged me to leave it alone. But I had to know. I had to see what was living beneath our home. I saw faces. Human faces pressed up against the underside of the floorboards, staring up at us through the gaps. Their eyes were wrong. Too large, too reflective, like animal eyes caught in headlights. Their mouths moved constantly, forming words I couldn't hear from that distance. There were dozens of them, packed together in the crawl space, shoulder to shoulder, all looking up, all watching. One of them saw me looking. Our eyes met through that narrow gap. It smiled. Its teeth were filed to points. I jerked backwards so hard I knocked over my chair. My wife was screaming. She'd seen them too. We ran to the bedroom and barricaded the door with furniture. The whispers that night were deafening. They called our names over and over in voices that cycled through everyone we'd ever known. Parents, friends, colleagues, even people from our childhood. Perfect imitations, horrible mimicry. And they made us an offer. Come down, they whispered. Join us below. It's warm here. Safe here. They've been waiting so long for company. Come down and stay forever. The scratching intensified. The floorboards began to bow upward in places as something pushed from underneath. We could see the wood flexing, see the nails starting to pull free. They were trying to come up. That's when my wife told me the truth about her grandmother. The real reason she lived alone for 43 years. Her husband hadn't. He disappeared. He'd gone into the crawl space. The grandmother had heard him down there one winter night, calling her name, begging her to help him. She opened that small door and found him standing in the darkness below, changed somehow. Wrong. He told her to come down, to bring the children down, to let the house have what it wanted. She refused. She locked him in and never opened that door again. For 4 decades, she listened to him whisper her name. Listened to him beg and threaten and promise. And slowly, he'd been joined by others. People who wandered onto the property. Travelers who stopped to ask for help. The house collected them, added them to whatever lived beneath. The grandmother, his last words before she died were a warning. Dawn, to feed the house. Dawn, to give it names. Dawn, to let it know you. Re-listening. We broken all our rules. We answered when they called. We looked. We engaged. And now the house knew we were aware. Now it wanted us. The scratching reached a crescendo. The floor in front of our bedroom door began to splinter. Long cracks spread through the wood like spider webs. We could see pale fingers pushing through from below, testing the wood, pulling at the boards. I made a decision. I grabbed the spare gas can from the garage. 5 gallons of fuel I brought for the generator. I poured it through every gap in the floorboards. I soaked that crawl space. The whispers turned to shrieks. High-pitched and inhuman. Terrifying. My wife thought I was going to burn the house down. But I had a different plan. I told her to get in the car and drive. Dawn, to stop. Dawn, to look back. Get to town and call the fire department. Tell them anything. But get away from this place. She left. I waited until I couldn't see her taillights anymore. Then I went to the crawlspace entrance on the back porch. The door was shaking. The padlock was bending. Something was trying to break through from inside. The whispers had become screams. My name mixed with threats and curses and promises of what they'd do when they got free. I didn't light the fire. Instead, I did something that still haunts me. I opened the door. The smell hit me first. Decay and chemicals and something sweet like rotting fruit. The darkness beyond was absolute. My flashlight beam barely penetrated it, but I could see them in there. Dozens of pale figures crouched in the shadows. Naked. Filthy. Their eyes reflecting my light like animals. They'd been human once. Maybe they still were, in some horrible way. The closest one reached for me. Its hand was skeletal, its fingers impossibly long. When it spoke, I recognized my father, his voice again. But the face was wrong. Stretched, distorted, like someone wearing a mask made from memory and nightmare. Come down, son. It's not so bad once you adjust. We family down here. We take care of each other. The house provides. I slammed the door and locked it. But I didn't pour the gasoline. I couldn't. Because some of those faces in the darkness had looked familiar. Old photographs I'd seen from my wife. His family albums. People who supposedly moved away or died in accidents. All of them staring out at me from that crawl space with hungry, desperate eyes. The fire department came. They found nothing. The crawl space was empty except for old tools and normal house debris. No people, no scratches, no symbols. They said I'd been hallucinating. Carbon monoxide poisoning, maybe, or stress. They recommended we install detectors and get some rest. But I know what I saw, and I know what I heard. Because that night in the motel, I heard whispers coming from beneath our bed. Soft at first, then louder, my name mixed with my wife. Calling us, promising us that the house misses us. That it is waiting. We never went back. We abandoned the property. Let the bank take it. I don't. Do you know who lives there now? I don't want to know. Because I understand the truth about that place. It is not haunted. Haunted implies the dead. This is something older. Something that was there before the house was built. Something that learned if you build a structure over emptiness and invite people to live in it, eventually someone will fall through. The whispers still follow me. I hear them in quiet moments. In parking garages and office buildings and shopping malls. Anywhere there is a gap. Anywhere there is space between the surface and what lies below. They re patient. They have time. And they re still calling my name. Last week, I found scratches on our apartment floor, long gouges in the hardwood. And when I pressed my ear to the ground, I heard them. Dozens of voices, whispering, waiting. The house taught them how to travel. Now they underneath everything. And they hungry for company. Trails in the mountains are passed down just like stories. And when one begins to change, it is rarely an accident. Story 7. Church that locked itself. The day I found my grandfather's journal, I discovered that some doors are meant to stay locked forever. I'm talking about the old Mercer Creek Church, deep in the Appalachian hills of West Virginia. If you've ever driven through coal country, you know the kind of place I mean. Forgotten roads that wind through valleys where the sun barely reaches. Small communities that died when the mines closed. Buildings left to rot, their windows like empty eye sockets staring at nothing. My grandfather was the last pastor of Mercer Creek Church before it was abandoned in 1973. He died when I was 8, and I barely remember him. But last month, my mother asked me to clean out his old storage unit outside Charleston. That is where I found the journal, wrapped in oilcloth and hidden inside a locked metal box. The key was taped underneath with a note in his shaking handwriting. Burn this unread if you value your peace of mind. I didn't burn it. That was my first mistake. The journal detailed something horrifying that happened during the final weeks before the church closed. Something that explained why the building had been sealed up and left to decay for 50 years. Something that made my skin crawl as I read those yellowing pages by flashlight in that dusty storage unit. According to my grandfather, it started on a Sunday in August. Services had ended around noon, like always. The congregation filed out into the humid mountain air, shaking hands and making small talk about the weather and whose garden was doing best that year. My grandfather locked the front doors from the outside, just like he did every week. He checked them twice because the church held donation money in a safe inside his office. But when he returned Monday morning to prepare for a funeral, the doors were locked from the inside. Not just locked, the heavy wooden beam that barred the doors from within had been lowered into place. There was no way to do that from outside. Someone had to be inside the church to drop that beam. My grandfather walked around the entire building, checking every window, every possible entry point. Everything was sealed tight. No broken glass, no forced locks, nothing. He eventually had to break a window to climb inside. The church was empty, completely empty. But the beam had definitely been lowered from within. And there was something else, something that made him pause in the doorway of the sanctuary, his heart suddenly hammering. The smell. He described it as sweet and rotten at the same time, like fruit left too long in the sun. It filled the entire church, thick and cloying, making him gag. But there was no source, no dead animal, no forgotten food, just that terrible smell hanging in the air like something invisible and putrid. The funeral went ahead that afternoon, though my grandfather said several people commented on the strange odor. He tried to air the place out, opened every window, but the smell wouldn't leave. It seemed to seep from the walls themselves. That night, he decided to sleep in the church. He needed to understand what was happening. He needed to know if someone was playing a sick joke or if something else was going on. Something he couldn't explain. What he witnessed that night changed him forever. According to the journal, he woke around 3 a.m. to the sound of footsteps. Heavy boots walking across the wooden floor of the sanctuary. He lay perfectly still in his office, barely breathing, listening to those deliberate steps moving through the darkness. Back and forth, like someone pacing, like someone waiting. He gathered his courage and crept to the office door. Through the crack, he could see into the sanctuary. Moonlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the pews in silver light. And there, walking between the rows, was a shadow. Not a person, a shadow. It had no features, no face, just a dark human shape that moved independently of any light source. It walked like it was searching for something, like it was hunting. My grandfather watched in frozen terror as the shadow stopped at the altar. It stood there for a long moment, then slowly turned to face his office door. Even though it had no eyes, he knew it was looking directly at him, staring through the crack, seeing him crouched there in the darkness. Then it started walking toward him. He slammed the office door and locked it, his hands shaking so badly he could barely turn the key. The footsteps continued, getting closer, stopping right outside his door. The handle began to turn, slowly, testing the lock. The wood creaked under some unseen pressure. And that smell, that horrible sweet rot, grew so strong he thought he might pass out. He pressed himself against the far wall, praying silently, begging God for protection. The handle stopped turning. The footsteps moved away, but he didn't leave that office until dawn broke through the windows. When he finally emerged, the church was empty again. But the front doors, the ones he left unlocked when he decided to stay overnight, were now locked from the inside. That wooden beam was in place, and scratched into the surface of the altar, deep gouges in the old wood, were 3 words: "We are waiting." My grandfather tried to tell the church elders what he experienced. They thought he was losing his mind. Stress, they said. Too much responsibility. Maybe it was time to retire. But then it happened again. And again. Every few nights, the church would lock itself from the inside. Every time, that terrible smell would intensify. And every time my grandfather or someone else managed to get inside, they could find new scratches. New messages carved into wood or etched into the walls. "Let us out. We cannot leave. Help us. It won. Let us go." The messages were terrifying, but what scared my grandfather more was the realization that something was trapped inside that church. Multiple somethings, based on the plural pronouns. Entities that had somehow become imprisoned within those walls and were desperate to escape. Or maybe they were warning people to stay away. The journal wasn't clear on that point because my grandfather himself didn't understand. The final entry was dated September 15th, 1973. My grandfather described how the church board had decided to permanently close the building. They claimed it was due to declining attendance, but he knew the truth. They were all afraid. Everyone who had experienced the locked doors, the shadows, the messages, the smell, they all wanted that place sealed forever. The night before the final service, my grandfather returned to the church one last time. He needed to understand what was happening. He needed answers before walking away from his calling. He brought a flashlight, a Bible, and a tape recorder. He was going to document whatever happened. What he recorded that night was erased. The tape was blank when he played it back. But in his journal, he described what the recorder couldn't capture. He saw them, all of them. The shadows weren't shadows at all. They were people, or they had been people once. Dozens of figures, translucent and gray, filling the pews like a phantom congregation. They sat perfectly still, hands folded, heads bowed, as if waiting for a service that would never come. And at the pulpit stood something else. Something tall and dark that wore the shape of a man but moved wrong, its limbs bending at impossible angles. It spoke to him, not in words but directly into his mind. And what it told him made him understand why the church had to be abandoned. Why it could never be used again. Long before the church was built, that land had been used for something else. Something dark, a place where people had gathered for rituals that had nothing to do with God. They had opened something in that valley, a doorway to somewhere terrible. And when the church was later built on that same ground, hoping to consecrate the cursed earth, it had instead trapped those who had opened the door. Trapped them forever in a space between worlds, unable to move forward or back. Forever waiting in that awful in-between. The entity at the pulpit told my grandfather that every person who worshipped in that church added to its power. Every prayer, every hymn, every moment of faith fed the thing that held those souls prisoner. The church wasn't a sanctuary. It was a cage, and everyone who had ever attended services there had unknowingly strengthened the bars. My grandfather fled that night and never returned. The church held its final service the next day, and afterward, the building was boarded up. The doors were chained from outside. No one was allowed inside ever again. Over the years, locals reported seeing lights in the windows late at night, hearing singing when no one was there, seeing the doors standing open in the morning even though they'd been locked tight the night before. Eventually, people stopped going near that part of the valley. The road grew over. The forest reclaimed the clearing. The church became a local legend, a creepy story kids told each other around campfires. But most people forgot it had ever existed. I should have burned that journal. Instead, I drove to West Virginia last week. I needed to see the place for myself. I needed to know if it was real or if my grandfather had suffered some kind of breakdown in his final years. It took me 2 days to find the old church. The road was completely gone, swallowed by decades of undergrowth. I had to hike 3 miles through dense forest, following GPS coordinates I decalculated from old property records. But I found it, standing in a clearing so overgrown it was almost invisible. The white paint had long since peeled away. The windows were broken. The roof sagged. But it was still there, waiting. The chains on the doors had rusted 3 years ago. I pushed, and they swung open easily. That smell hit me immediately. Sweet rot. Decay. Exactly like my grandfather had described. It made my eyes water and my stomach turn. But I went inside anyway. The sanctuary was a ruin. Pews collapsed and covered in mold. The altar cracked and leaning. But I could still see the scratches, hundreds of them, covering every surface. Messages carved so deep they survived 50 years of abandonment. I pulled out my phone to take pictures. The moment I raised it, the doors behind me slammed shut. The sound echoed through the ruined church like a gunshot. I spun around, my heart in my throat. The heavy wooden beam, rotted and ancient, had somehow fallen into place, barring the doors from inside. I was locked in. My phone died instantly, the battery draining from full to nothing in seconds. The flashlight I brought flickered and went dark. And in that sudden darkness, I heard them. Footsteps. Dozens of footsteps, moving through the shadows. Coming closer. I ran for the broken windows, throwing myself through splintered wood and shattered glass. I hit the ground outside and didn't stop running until I reached my car. My hands were bleeding. My clothes were torn. But I was out. When I looked back, every window of that church glowed with a faint, sickly light. And I could see them inside. Shadows pressed against the glass, watching me leave, waiting for the next person foolish enough to enter. I'm home now, but I can sleep. Because every night, around 3 a.m, I hear footsteps in my house. Heavy boots on hardwood floors. And that smell, that terrible sweet rot, it is starting to seep into my bedroom. Getting stronger each night. I think something followed me home from that church. Or maybe by breaking the seal my grandfather and the church board had created, I let something out. Something that had been trapped for 50 years, waiting for someone stupid enough to open those doors again. The journal is still in my possession. I should burn it like my grandfather wanted, but now I understand why he kept it instead. Because someone needs to know. Someone needs to understand what is waiting in that valley. What is locked inside that church. What walks between the pews in the darkness, holding souls prisoner in an endless, horrifying service. If you ever find yourself driving through the mountains of West Virginia, and you see an old white church standing alone in an overgrown clearing, keep driving. Stop, to go inside, because some doors lock themselves for a reason, and what is trapped behind them should stay trapped forever. But I'm afraid it is too late for me. The footsteps are getting closer every night, and last night, I found words scratched into my bedroom door. 3 words that made my blood run cold. Welcome home, Pastor. Story 8. Story no one finished. My grandfather stopped mid-sentence and never spoke again. That is how this whole terrifying nightmare started. And I need to tell someone before it is too late for me too. I was 11 years old, sitting on his porch in rural Kentucky on a summer night thick with humidity and the sound of crickets. He was telling me the family story, the one his father had told him, the one that went back 5 generations to when our people first settled in these hills. But he never finished it. He got to a specific point, went completely silent, and 3 days later he was dead. The doctor said it was a stroke, but I saw his face that night. I saw the fear. Every man in my family knows this story, or rather, knows the beginning of it. My great-grandfather told it to my grandfather. My grandfather started telling it to my father. My father tried telling it to me. But none of them ever reached the end. They all stopped at the exact same moment, as if some invisible force cut the words from their throats. And within a week of stopping, something terrible happened to each of them. I am 47 now. Last month, my son asked me to tell him about our family history. And like an idiot, I started telling him the story. I got further than anyone before me. And now I understand why they all stopped. Now I know it waits at the end. And I am running out of time. The story begins in 1847. Our ancestor, Jonathan Weir, bought 200 acres in the Cumberland Gap for almost nothing. The locals wouldn't go near that land. They said it was cursed, that the Cherokee who lived there before had abandoned it suddenly, leaving behind warnings carved into the trees. But Jonathan was stubborn and poor, and cheap land was cheap land. He built a cabin. He brought his wife and 3 children. And for the first few months, everything seemed fine. Then the knocking started. Every night at exactly midnight, something knocked on their cabin door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Jonathan would open the door to find nothing there. Just darkness and forest and the creepy sound of wind through the trees. This happened every single night for 2 weeks. Always the same pattern. Always at midnight. The family tried to ignore it, but the fear was eating at them. On the 15th night, Jonathan, His wife begged him not to answer. She said she heard something disturbing the night before. When the knocking came, she heard a voice outside. Soft and strange. It had been calling their children's names. Jonathan dismissed her fears. When midnight came and the knocking started, he opened the door like always. But this time, something was there, standing just beyond the threshold. He saw it for only a moment before his lantern went out. In that brief flash of light, he saw a figure that was wrong in ways he couldn't articulate. Too tall, too thin, its face obscured by shadow that didn't move with the light. The figure spoke to him. It said it had been waiting, that the land belonged to it, that Jonathan, his family was trespassing. But it would make a deal. Jonathan could stay, his family could prosper. But in exchange, every generation would owe a debt. One night every 100 years, the figure would return. And one person from the family would have to go with it into the darkness. If they refused, the entire bloodline would be cursed. Jonathan was terrified but pragmatic. 100 years was a lifetime. Multiple lifetimes. He could buy his family security and let future generations deal with the consequences. So he agreed. He shook hands with something that felt like ice and dead leaves. And the figure vanished into the forest. This is where my grandfather stopped telling the story. This is where they all stopped. Right at the moment of the handshake. And for years, I thought maybe that was just the ending. Maybe there was nothing more to tell. But 3 weeks ago, I found my great-great-grandfather, this journal in a box of family papers. And I learned the horrible truth. The story doesn't end with the handshake. That is where the danger begins. Because Jonathan Weir didn't tell anyone the complete truth about his deal. He wrote it down in his journal, hidden it away, and made his children promise never to speak of it. The actual terms of the agreement were far worse than a simple debt paid once a century. The figure had tricked him. The real curse was in the telling. Every time someone from our family tells the story, they activate something. They send out a signal, and the figure hears it. It starts to wake up. It starts to remember. And if anyone ever tells the complete story, if anyone ever speaks the final words out loud, the 100-year timer resets immediately. The figure returns that very night. And it doesn't just take one person. It takes everyone who heard the story. My ancestors figured this out the hard way. Jonathan, his son, told the complete story to his own children in 1891. That night, the figure came. It took all 3 of his children. They walked into the forest holding hands, their eyes glazed and empty, following something the father couldn't see. They were never found. Their bodies never recovered. The son went mad with grief. Before he died, he wrote a warning. Never finish the story. Never speak the ending out loud. Stop before the handshake is complete. Because the handshake is a doorway. And once that door is fully opened through spoken words, the figure can cross over. It can come for anyone connected by blood or by listening. This is why my grandfather stopped mid-sentence. Why they all did. They felt it. That presence. That attention. Focusing on them from somewhere dark and patient. They felt the figure listening through time and shadow, waiting for someone foolish enough to complete the ritual. But I didn't. When my son asked about our family history, I told him everything I found in that journal. I read the words out loud. I described the handshake. I spoke the figure, this true nature, into existence. And the moment I finished, I felt it. The temperature dropped. My breath came out in white clouds despite it being August. And I heard it, soft at first, then louder, knocking. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Not on my door, on every door in my house simultaneously. Upstairs, downstairs, front and back, the garage, even the closets. All knocking in perfect synchronization. My son heard it too. His face went pale. He asked me what was happening. I couldn't answer. Because I knew. I completed the story. I opened the doorway. And now the figure was coming. The knocking continued for 3 hours that first night. It would stop for exactly 5 minutes, then start again. I called the police. They came and found nothing. No evidence of anyone on the property. But I could see the fear in the younger officer's eyes. He heard the knocking too. He just couldn't admit it. The second night, the knocking came earlier. 10 o'clock. And it was louder, harder. The doors rattled in their frames. My son was staying with his mother for safety, but I could feel the figure, this attention expanding. Reaching out, searching for everyone who heard the complete story. On the 3rd night, I saw it. I was standing in my kitchen when the motion sensor light in the backyard triggered. There was something standing at the edge of the woods. Impossibly tall, impossibly thin. Its body was wrong. Its limbs bent at angles that defied anatomy. And its face, God help me, its face was a shadow that pulsed and writhed like it was full of insects. It raised one hand and beckoned, and I felt my body respond. My legs started moving toward the back door without my permission. My hand reached for the doorknob. I was screaming inside my own head, fighting for control, but something else was driving my actions. The deal, the curse, the price that had to be paid. I managed to stop myself by grabbing the kitchen counter. I held on with everything I had. The figure watched me struggle, and then it smiled. I could see teeth in that writhing shadow. Too many teeth, sharp and irregular and eager. It tapped on the glass door 3 times. Then it turned and walked back into the forest, moving in a way that made my eyes hurt. Like reality bent around it with each step. That was 4 nights ago. Since then, the knocking has spread. My son calls me terrified because he hears it at his mother's house. My brother in Ohio called. He hears it too. And my nephew in Texas. And my cousin in Florida. Everyone connected to our bloodline is being marked. Being called. The figure is patient. It's waited over 150 years. It can wait a little longer while we exhaust ourselves with fear. I've tried researching solutions. I've talked to people who claim to know about curses and folklore. But here, it's the truly terrifying part. There is a reason the story was never finished. Because finishing it doesn't to just summon the figure. It gives it permission to evolve, to spread, to become something more than what it was. I found one final entry in my great-great-grandfather's journal, written in handwriting that was barely legible, scrawled by someone whose mind was breaking. It said that the figure ISN, a demon or a ghost, it is older than those concepts. It is a story that became real, a narrative that gained consciousness through repetition and belief. Every time it is told, it grows stronger. Every time someone hears it, it gains another anchor point in our reality. And now that I've completed the story, been given it full form, they've spoken it into its most powerful state. The knocking I hear ISN, to a warning. It is applause. The figure is thanking me for feeding it, for making it real enough to take physical form. Last night, my front door opened on its own. I delocked it, bolted it, barricaded it with furniture, but the locks undid themselves. The bolt slid back, the furniture moved silently aside, and the door swung open to reveal complete darkness. Not the normal darkness of night. This was different. Absolute. Hungry. I heard footsteps in that darkness. Coming closer. 3 slow steps, then stopping. Waiting. The figure is inside my house now. Living in the spaces between rooms. Existing in the shadows that don't quite match their sources. I see it in my peripheral vision. A tall, thin outline that vanishes when I turn to look directly. My son won. To answer my calls anymore. I think he's already gone. Walked into whatever darkness the figure brings with it. I tried calling other family members, but most don't to pick up. The ones who do sound distant, distracted, like they re-listening to something I can to hear. I am writing this down as a warning. If anyone in your family has an old story that no one finishes, leave it alone. Don't to dig into family papers. Don't to complete the narrative. Some stories are left unfinished for a reason. Some words should never be spoken, because there are things that exist in the space between told and untold. Things that feed on completion. Things that wait for someone curious enough or stupid enough to give them form. The knocking just started again, but it is not coming from the doors anymore. It is coming from inside the walls, from underneath the floor, from the ceiling above my head. The figure is everywhere now, surrounding me, and I can hear something else beneath the knocking. A voice, soft and strange and filled with gratitude. It is thanking me for finishing the story, for giving it permission to cross over completely, for feeding it with words and attention and fear. And now it is asking me to come outside, to complete the deal my ancestor made, to walk into the darkness like all the others before me. My hand is reaching for the doorknob. I am not controlling it anymore. The story is controlling me, and I understand now why they all stopped mid-sentence, why they chose death over completion, because finishing the story doesn't to just curse the teller. It curses everyone who ever hears it. It turns them into characters, parts of a narrative that never truly ends. It just adds new chapters, new victims, new voices to call out in the darkness. If you re-listening to this, I'm sorry. Because now you heard it too. Now you re-part of the story. And tonight, at midnight, you'll hear 3 slow knocks. Don, to answer. Don, to open the door. And whatever you do, Don, to tell anyone else what you heard here. Because the figure is always listening. and it was always hungry for more. The knocking is at my door right now. 3 times. Final. Commanding. And my body is walking toward it. I can. Stop. The story demands an ending. And I am going to give it one. Just remember, some stories should never be finished. Some words should die unspoken. And if you ever hear 3 slow knocks at midnight, pray you never learned why. Ownership meant little in the mountains. Some houses simply decided who could stay and who would eventually leave. Story 9. House that refused new owners. I should have listened to the realtor, his silence when I asked why the price was so low. That silence, thick and heavy, should have been enough to make me walk away. But I was desperate, broke, haunted by debts I couldn't pay. The house on Mercer Road seemed like salvation, not damnation. I was wrong about a lot of things back then. I was especially wrong about that house. The property had been on the market for 3 years. In a town like Ashbrook, Nebraska, where real estate moved slower than moss growing on tombstones, 3 years wasn't unusual. But this house was different. The listing had been refreshed 17 times. 17 different families had signed papers, moved in, and then fled before 12 months passed. Every single one gave a different reason for leaving. Every single reason felt like a lie wrapped around something darker they refused to name. The Hendersons said the foundation was unstable. The Kowalskis claimed mold in the walls made them sick. The Price family insisted the electrical wiring was dangerous, though 3 separate inspections found nothing wrong. The Delgados simply vanished one night, leaving furniture, clothes, and a half-eaten dinner on the kitchen table. Nobody ever saw them again. The police filed a missing persons report that went cold within weeks. After that, the house sat empty for 8 months before another foolish family tried to make it home. I learned these details after I moved in, after it was too late to turn back. The first week felt normal. Almost. I unpacked boxes in daylight, arranging my few belongings in rooms that echoed with emptiness. The house was a 2-story Victorian built in 1892, with original hardwood floors that creaked in familiar ways and windows that rattled when wind pushed against the glass. Nothing about it screamed danger. Nothing visible, anyway. But there was something in the air itself. Something I couldn't name. A thickness. A weighting quality that made my skin prickle when I stood too long in certain corners. The bedroom on the 2nd floor faced west, catching the last light of day through tall windows that overlooked an overgrown garden. I chose that room because it felt the least oppressive. The other bedrooms had a weight to them, a heaviness that pressed down on my chest whenever I stepped inside. I told myself it was just old house syndrome, that mixture of musty air and decades of accumulated silence that makes any abandoned building feel unsettling. I was good at lying to myself back then. Night brought different truths. The first time I heard the footsteps, I was half asleep, drifting in that space between consciousness and dreams where reality blurs into shadow. The sound started on the 1st floor, a slow, deliberate pattern moving through the dining room toward the stairs. Not the random creaking of old wood settling. These were footsteps, purposeful, measured, climbing. I sat up in bed, heart hammering against my ribs, and listened as those steps reached the 2nd floor landing. They paused outside my door. I could hear breathing on the other side of the wood, slow and steady, like someone standing perfectly still and listening back. The doorknob never turned. The door never opened. But whatever stood outside remained there for 10 full minutes while I held my breath and prayed for morning. When dawn finally broke through my windows, I found the hallway empty. No footprints in the dust I hadn't yet swept away. No signs anyone had been there. I told myself it was my imagination, stress from the move, the unfamiliar sounds of a new home. More lies I wrapped around the truth like bandages on a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. The footsteps came back every night. Always the same pattern. Always stopping outside my door. Always that patient breathing on the other side. By the 2nd week, I started noticing other things. Doors I closed would be standing open when I returned to a room. Objects moved from where I placed them. Small things at first. A coffee mug migrating from the kitchen counter to the windowsill. A book I left on the couch appearing on the mantel. Keys shifting from one table to another. I blamed memory, fatigue, the disorientation of living alone in too much space. Then I found the photographs. They were hidden in the attic, stuffed inside a cardboard box shoved beneath the eaves where spiders had built kingdoms of web and shadow. I'd gone up there looking for the source of scratching sounds I'd been hearing in the walls. Instead, I found 17 photo albums, one for each family that had tried to live here. Every album told the same story in pictures that grew progressively more disturbing. The first pages always showed happy families moving in, smiling faces, hope in their eyes, children playing in the yard, adults painting walls and hanging curtains, normal life beginning in a new home. But as you turned pages, something changed in those photographs. The smiles became forced, eyes grew hollow and haunted. People stood differently, shoulders hunched, heads turned as if listening to something just outside the frame. In the background of later photos, you could see it. The decay, paint peeling from walls that had been fresh weeks before, gardens dying despite obvious care, windows darkening even in bright daylight. The final photographs in every album showed empty rooms, abandoned furniture, doors standing open. Not a single family had bothered to take their photo albums when they fled. That detail terrified me more than anything else. What kind of fear makes you leave behind your memories? I brought the albums downstairs and spread them across the dining room table, studying each one under the harsh light of the chandelier. The scratching in the walls grew louder as I worked, moving through the house like something pacing behind the plaster. I ignored it. I needed to understand what happened to those families. I needed to know what was happening to me. The pattern became clear around midnight. Each family lasted between 8 and 11 months. Each family documented their slow unraveling in photographs that captured something I couldn't quite see but could definitely feel. A presence, a watching. In every album, there were pictures where the cameras had caught something wrong. A shadow that fell at the wrong angle. A reflection in a mirror showing a room that didn't match the one being photographed. Faces in windows when everyone in the family was accounted for elsewhere. In the Henderson album, there was a photo of their daughter's birthday party. 12 children sitting around a table, but 13 shadows on the wall behind them. In the Kowalski album, a family dinner showed every person at the table except in the reflection of the china cabinet glass, where an extra figure sat at the head of the table. A figure with no face. Just darkness where features should have been. I was studying that photograph when the chandelier above me began to sway. No wind, no earthquake, just a slow pendulum motion that made the light swing across the walls in nauseating arcs. The scratching in the walls stopped. The house fell into a silence so complete I could hear my own blood moving through my veins. Then the breathing started again. Not from upstairs this time. From everywhere. From the walls themselves. From the floors. From the ceiling. The entire house breathing in slow, synchronized rhythm. I ran. I grabbed my car keys and ran for the front door, but it wouldn't open. The deadbolt turned. The knob twisted, but the door stayed shut as if welded to the frame. I tried the back door, the side door, every window on the first floor, all sealed, all refusing to let me leave. The breathing grew louder, the chandelier swung wider, and then I heard it, a voice speaking from everywhere and nowhere, saying words I couldn't understand in a language that hurt to hear. The photographs on the table began to move, not blowing in wind, moving, images shifting inside their frames like something was reaching through them, trying to pull itself into this world. I backed away from the table, pressing myself against the wall, and that is when I felt it. The wall was warm, pulsing, like flesh, like something alive had been hiding beneath the plaster all along, wearing the house like skin, waiting for someone foolish enough to stay. The scratching in the walls wasn't T-rats. It was fingernails, hundreds of them, clawing from the inside. I don't remember how I got out. Memory fails at the crucial moment, leaving only fragments. Breaking glass, cold air on my face. Running through the overgrown garden while the house screamed behind me. The sound it made wasn't wind through broken windows. It was rage, hunger, the fury of something that had been fed and was being denied its meal. I spent that night in my car parked 3 blocks away, watching the house through my rearview mirror. Every light inside blazed. Shadows moved behind the windows. Shapes that weren't human, performing movements that defied anatomy. And in the morning, when I finally worked up the courage to drive past, the house looked normal again. Quiet, empty, waiting. I never went back inside. I called the realtor and told them I was breaking the lease. They didn't argue. They heard it all before. I became the 18th family to flee. I gave my reason as personal circumstances, which was technically true. The circumstances were very personal. They involved my sanity. 3 months later, I saw a new listing for the house. A young couple had signed papers. They had a baby. They looked so happy in their profile picture, standing in front of that Victorian with hope in their eyes and death waiting behind them in rooms they couldn't yet imagine. I tried to warn them. I called. I emailed. I drove back to Ashbrook and knocked on the door. The man who answered looked at me with suspicion and pity. He thought I was crazy. Maybe I was. Maybe the house had broken something in me that would never heal. But you seen the photographs. I heard the breathing. I felt the walls pulse with terrible life. He closed the door in my face. Through the window, I could see his wife holding their baby in the living room, singing softly while sunlight streamed through clean glass. She looked so peaceful, so unaware. In 6 months, maybe 8, she would look different. Haunted, hollow. In the photographs they would take before fleeing, you would see the shadows falling wrong. The reflections showing things that shouldn't exist. The house always gets its photographs. It feeds on the slow decay of hope, documenting each family's descent into fear. And when they finally break, when they finally run, it sits empty and patient, waiting for the next residents to sign their names and step across the threshold into rooms that hunger. I still dream about those albums, about the final photographs that showed empty rooms and open doors, about what might have been waiting just outside the frame, watching as families abandoned their memories and fled into night. The house refused those owners, all of them, but it never let them go completely. Part of them stayed behind in those photographs, trapped in images that showed their slow unraveling. Sometimes I wonder if part of me is still there too, caught in a picture I never saw, standing in a room I can to escape, waiting for someone to find my album and understand the warning. The house on Mercer Road is still standing, still waiting, still refusing to let anyone stay but never letting anyone truly leave. And somewhere in its dark rooms, 17 photo albums sit in an attic box, documenting the terrible patience of something that wears architecture like skin and feeds on the horror of families who thought they found home. The realtor never mentions the albums. They never mention the breathing walls or the shadows that fall wrong. They just show the house to new families and smile while papers are signed. After all, someone has to feed it. Someone always does. The house demands it. And in this forgotten corner of Nebraska, where secrets grow like weeds between the corn, nobody asks the questions that might save them. I should have listened to that silence. Should have heard the warning in what wasn't, he said. But desperation makes us deaf to danger. And the house knows this. It counts on it. Every family that enters believes they'll be different. They never are. The house refuses them all, eventually. But it takes its time. It takes its photographs. It takes whatever piece of them it needs before releasing them back into a world where nobody will believe what they've seen. That is the real horror. Not that the house exists, but that it will always find new residents. Always find people desperate enough or foolish enough to ignore the warnings. To see the low price and think they found a bargain instead of a trap. The house on Mercer Road will still be there long after I am gone, still breathing in the dark, still scratching behind the walls, still waiting for the next family to walk through its door and begin the slow documentation of their own unraveling. And somewhere in that attic, another album waits to be filled with photographs showing hope turning to horror, one image at a time, until the final picture captures empty rooms and the house breathing alone again in patient satisfaction. The final stories were never meant to be finished, because in Appalachia, completing certain stories meant inviting them to continue elsewhere. Story 10. Trail that changed direction. The trail marker I carved into that oak tree 30 years ago is gone. Not weathered away or overgrown. Gone, like it never existed. And that is when I knew the forest had finally decided it was my turn. I am a hunting guide in northern Montana. I've walked the Black Pine Trail 1,000 times since I was 16 years old. I know every twist, every landmark, every place where the deer cross at dawn. Or at least I thought I did. Because 3 weeks ago, I took a client into those woods and discovered something terrifying. The trail had moved, not just changed slightly, it had rearranged itself entirely. And judging by the stories my grandfather told me before he disappeared in those same woods, I should have known better than to follow it. Every small town has its legends. Ours is about the Black Pine Trail. Old-timers say it's been shifting for over 100 years, leading hunters and hikers to places that don't exist on any map. Most people laugh it off as superstition or poor navigation. But those of us who have lived here long enough know the truth. The trail is alive in some awful way. It watches, it waits, and when it decides you're ready, it takes you somewhere you were never meant to go. My grandfather warned me about it when I was 12. He said the forest had rules. Never follow the trail at dusk. Never go alone after the first snow. And most importantly, if you see markers you don't recognize, turn back immediately. He disappeared on a solo hunting trip in 1994. Search parties combed those woods for 3 weeks. They found his rifle and his pack exactly where the trail should have ended. But there was no end. The trail just kept going, winding deeper into terrain that shouldn't exist. The search was called off. The official report said he got disoriented and died of exposure. But I saw the fear in the searchers' eyes. They'd seen something out there, something that made them never want to go back. I should have remembered his warnings. But 30 years of walking the same path makes you complacent, makes you think you understand something just because it is familiar. I was wrong. 3 weeks ago, a client from Denver hired me for a 5-day elk hunt. Standard job. We set out at dawn on a clear October morning, following the Black Pine Trail into the high country. I did walk this exact route 2 days earlier to scout. I knew what to expect. The trail climbs steadily for 3 miles, crosses Widow Creek at the Fallen Cedar, then forks left toward the ridgeline. But when we reached the creek, there was no Fallen Cedar. The crossing was completely different. The water ran in the wrong direction, and the fork that should have been there had vanished. Instead, the trail continued straight, cutting through terrain I'd never seen before. My client didn't notice anything wrong. Why would he? He'd never been here before. But I felt it immediately, that creeping sense of wrongness. The trees were positioned differently. The light fell at an angle that didn't match the time of day. And there was a smell in the air. Not unpleasant exactly, just wrong, like flowers blooming in the wrong season, like earth that had been turned over by something other than natural weather. I checked my GPS. According to the device, we were exactly where we should be. The map showed the trail continuing as expected, but my eyes told me different. The forest around us didn't match the topography I'd known my entire life. It was like someone had taken the landscape and shifted it 3 degrees to the left. Everything familiar, but nothing quite right. I wanted to turn back. Every instinct screamed at me to retreat, but my client was paying good money, and I kept telling myself I was just tired, disoriented. The changing seasons sometimes alter the appearance of familiar places. I convinced myself it was nothing, that we'd find our way to the usual camping spot by nightfall. We kept walking, and the trail kept changing. At first, the shifts were subtle. A boulder I didn't remember. A clearing that seemed too perfectly circular. But as the day wore on, the changes became more obvious. We passed the same distinctive lightning-struck pine 3 times from 3 different directions. Each time it appeared, it was in a different stage of decay. The first time, it was freshly damaged. The second time, it was weathered gray. The third time, it was so old the wood had turned to powder. My client finally noticed. He asked me if we were lost. I lied and told him we were taking a longer route to avoid disturbing a known elk bedding area. But inside, I was terrified. The trail was looping, folding back on itself in ways that violated basic geography. And with each loop, we were going deeper. Not deeper into the forest, deeper into something else. By late afternoon, we found the first marker. It was a cairn of stone stacked beside the trail. Deliberate, man-made, but the stones were wrong. They were perfectly smooth, like river rocks. But we were miles from any water, and they were arranged in a spiral pattern that hurt to look at. The proportions were off in a way I couldn't articulate. My eyes wanted to slide away from the pattern, but something else pulled my attention back. My client wanted to photograph it. I told him we needed to keep moving, but when we looked up from the cairn, the trail had split into 3 paths. 3 identical trails diverging into 3 different directions, and I knew with absolute certainty that none of them led back the way we come. I chose the middle path. I don't know why. Instinct maybe, or something else guiding my decision. We walked for another hour as the sun dropped toward the horizon. The forest grew darker faster than it should have. The shadows stretched wrong, and I started noticing things in those shadows. Shapes that looked almost human but moved with a gait that was just slightly off. They stayed at the edge of my vision, disappearing when I turned to look directly. We made camp in a small clearing as full dark fell. My client was nervous but trying to hide it. I built a fire and prepared a meal, going through the familiar motions to calm myself. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Not by animals, by the forest itself, like the trees had eyes hidden in their bark, like the ground beneath us was aware of our presence. That night, I heard voices in the woods, soft, distant, speaking words I couldn't quite make out. My client heard them too. He asked if there were other hunters nearby. I told him sound carries strangely in the mountains. But I knew better. Those voices weren't coming from any direction. They were coming from everywhere, from the trees and the earth and the air itself. The forest was speaking, and it was calling us deeper. I didn't sleep. I sat by the fire and watched the darkness beyond our small circle of light. And I saw things moving out there. Not animals, not people, things that existed in the space between solid and shadow. Things that were shaped wrong. Things that had too many limbs or not enough. Things that watched us with hunger that had nothing to do with food. At dawn, I made a decision. We were turning back. I didn't care about the client, his money, or his trophy elk. We were leaving, but when I looked for the trail we'd taken into the clearing, it was gone. The forest had closed around us. There were no paths at all, just endless trees in every direction. We were trapped. My client panicked. He wanted to use his phone to call for help, but there was no signal. There hadn't been a signal since we crossed the creek that wasn't the creek. We were beyond the reach of the normal world, beyond the reach of anything familiar or safe. I picked a direction and started walking. I marked trees as we went, carving arrows to show our path. But within 20 minutes, we came across my own markings from a different angle. We were walking in circles. The forest was playing with us, leading us nowhere, or everywhere, or somewhere specific that it wanted us to reach. That is when I found my grandfather's marker, the one he carved into a tree the day he disappeared. I recognized his initials and the date, but the tree was wrong. It was young, maybe 15 years old, far too young to have been there in 1994, but the carving was genuine, old and weathered, carved decades ago into a tree that hadn't existed at the time. The trail had brought him here, and now it had brought me. This was its purpose. This was what it did. It collected people, led them into a place that existed alongside the normal forest but separate from it. A place where time didn't flow correctly, where geography was fluid, where the rules of reality bent and twisted like the paths themselves. I looked at my client. He was staring at the marker with growing horror. He finally understood. We weren't lost. We were taken, and the forest wasn't going to let us leave. We walked for 3 more days, or what felt like 3 days. Time was unreliable there. The sun rose and set at irregular intervals. Sometimes dawn came hours after dusk. Sometimes night lasted for what felt like days. We passed through landscapes that couldn't exist. Meadows filled with flowers that glowed in the darkness. Streams that ran uphill. Cliffs that somehow existed in the middle of flat ground. And we saw others. People who had been taken by the trail over the years. They moved through the forest like ghosts, following paths only they could see. Some looked recent, their clothes modern, their bodies still solid. Others were translucent, fading, like they'd been walking for so long they were becoming part of the forest itself. My grandfather was among them. I recognized him despite the decades that had passed. He looked exactly as he had the day he disappeared. Not older, not younger, frozen in that moment when the trail had claimed him. He didn't acknowledge me. He just kept walking, following a path that led nowhere, his eyes fixed on some distant point I couldn't see. On what I think was the 4th day, we found the heart of it, the place where all the trails converged. It was a clearing filled with cairns like the first one we'd seen. Hundreds of them, thousands, stretching in every direction, each one marking a person the forest had taken, each one a memorial to someone who followed the trail too far. And in the center of the clearing was something I can properly describe. It wasn't the structure exactly. It was more like a wound in reality, a place where the normal world had been torn open to reveal something underneath. Something ancient and hungry and patient. The trail wasn't alive. It was a lure, a trap set by this thing to draw and prey. And every person it caught fed it, made it stronger, allowed it to extend its reach further. My client broke. He ran screaming into the forest. I tried to stop him, but he was too fast. He vanished into the trees, and I heard him running for a long time. Then silence. I never saw him again. I should have run too, but I was too tired, too defeated. I sat down among the cairns and waited for whatever came next. The shadows grew longer, the voices grew louder, and I felt the forest closing in around me, ready to add me to its collection. But something happened, something I still don't understand. As the darkness fell and the thing in the center of the clearing began to move toward me, I heard my grandfather, his voice. Clear and strong. He was calling my name, telling me to follow him. And when I looked up, he was there. Solid. Real. No longer translucent. He led me through the cairns, through passages I hadn't seen before, through places where the trail twisted back on itself in impossible ways. And gradually, The wrongness began to fade. The trees looked more normal. The light fell at natural angles. The voices quieted. We walked for hours, or maybe minutes. Time was still confused, but eventually, I recognized a landmark. The lightning struck pine, but this time it was in its current state, old and decaying. And beyond it, I could see the real trail. The normal trail, the one that led back to the world. My grandfather stopped at the edge. He couldn't cross. The forest held him. He looked at me with eyes full of sadness and warning. And then he faded, became translucent again, stepped back into the shadows where the lost ones walked forever. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out. I ran until I burst out of the tree line into a parking area where a ranger was just getting out of his truck. He stared at me in shock, asked me where I'd come from. When I told him I'd been lost for 4 days, he looked confused. He said it was only 6 in the evening, that I'd been gone for less than 10 hours. The search for my client is still ongoing. I'll never find him. I tried to explain about the trail, about how it shifts and takes people, but nobody believes me. They think I'm in shock, that I abandoned my client out of negligence or fear. The authorities are investigating me for possible criminal charges. I don't care. Let them investigate. Let them think I'm crazy. Because I know the truth. The Black Pine Trail is still out there, still shifting, still leading people to places they never intended to reach. And now that it has had a taste of me, I can feel it calling, trying to pull me back. I wake up at night with the urge to drive into those mountains, to walk into those woods, to follow the trail wherever it leads. The forest marked me, made me part of its collection. And even though I escaped, I'm not free. I never will be. Because once the trail knows you, it never stops hunting. Last week, I found a cairn in my backyard, smooth stones arranged in that same spiral pattern. And yesterday, the trees near my house looked different, positioned slightly wrong. The trail is spreading, coming for me, and I don't know how much longer I can resist its call. If you ever find yourself on an unfamiliar trail, pay attention. Notice if the markers look wrong, if the landscape shifts subtly, if time feels distorted, because once you realize the trail has changed, it's already too late. You were already part of its pattern, already being led somewhere you were never meant to reach, and you will never really escape. Even if you make it back, even if you survive, the trail will always be there in the back of your mind, calling, waiting, promising to show you wonders if they'll just follow it a little further, just a little deeper, just one more step into the darkness that never ends.